So I'm just going to, without any further ado, fire away. I'm from an environmental organisation called Planet Ark. We were first established in 1992, and it's really, as you can see, it's all about positive environmental actions for everyone. The opposite word there being positive. So it's not about what we can't do or we shouldn't do, it's what we can do, whether as individuals, corporations, councils, governments. What is it that we can do to reduce our impact on climate change? As you can see, there are really sort of three primary drivers: sustainable resource use, low carbon lifestyle, and bringing people back to nature. And to some degree at least, wood helps to talk about all of those. I manage a campaign called Make It Wood, which is predicated on increasing the use of responsibly sourced wood as a building material. And what we want to try and do is make sure we provide credible research-based information. So it's not just a marketing whim. There is a growing body of research which underpins everything that I'm going to talk about. It's a very easy role because timber has so many incredible facets to it, obviously from an aesthetic point of view, but particularly from an environmental point of view. As I mentioned, we're an environmental foundation. Now, the building industry ought to be low-hanging fruit. You'll see, these are figures that have been published. You may well see slight variations on this. The point being, timber has one, in fact, on a sector-by-sector basis, easily the biggest impact on climate change. As you can see, things like 35% of total CO2 emissions, 42% of energy consumption. And again, you may see variations on that thing. The important point is the building industry as a whole has a significant part to play. Wood has a big part to play potentially in ameliorating those impacts. There are really, I guess, from an environmental perspective, four primary reasons. First being, of course, that wood is renewable, the ultimate renewable. And we talk about a concept called ecological footprinting, living on nature's interest, not its capital. Now, just to put some numbers around that, the Yale University, which is one of the Ivy League colleges in the US, they did a study, it's a wee while ago now, back in 2014. And in that study, they concluded that the world's forests contain 385 billion cubic meters of timber. They also concluded that every year there's an additional 17 billion cubic meters growing, of which we're consuming about 3.4. So in other words, we're consuming about 20% of the additional growth, not eating into the capital, to extend that metaphor. No other building material can make a claim even remotely like that. The second one, wood stores carbon. As we all know from high school biology, through the process of photosynthesis, a tree will absorb CO2 and it'll emit oxygen, as Nigel mentioned earlier. Now, just to put some science and numbers around that, what happens is atmospheric carbon, CO2, is absorbed by the tree, and in the process of growing a tree creates what we call biogenic carbon. Now, on average, for a radiator pine with a moisture content of 12%, that's going to absorb about 800 kilos, 0.8 of a ton of CO2. And the ratio of atmospheric weights between atmospheric carbon, CO2, and biogenic carbon, which is a solid, is 44/12, 3.67. So for every cubic meter of, in this case, radiator pine, that's about 0.8 of a ton of CO2 that's been absorbed, which gives us about 220 kilos of biogenic carbon that's stored in that cubic meter of timber for as long as that timber exists. The oldest living timber building in the world is the Horyu Temple in Japan, and it was first erected in about 710. 1,300 years that it's been storing carbon. And I might add that's in an area where they're prone to both earthquakes and termites. So don't let anybody tell you that timber isn't durable. The other next important facet is timber has much less what we call embodied carbon than other more carbon-intensive materials like concrete and steel. Embodied carbon is all of the energy that goes into the production of a material, from raw material extraction, transportation, life and use, end-of-life disposal. You add all that energy together, and that's what we call the embodied carbon, or as George Chapper, who's with the Green Building Council, called it, upfront carbon emissions. Now, historically, there's been a Pareto effect. It was assumed that roughly 20% of the carbon emitted by a building would be embodied carbon, and about 80% would be operational. In other words, the power to provide air conditioning, heating, ventilation, lighting, etc. But with buildings becoming much more energy efficient, that ratio is now probably closer to a 40-60 split. So in other words, the more we can do to reduce embodied carbon, the bigger the impact that we can have. Timber has a significant part to play in that. Now, again, I don't want to denigrate concrete and steel because they have their place. And for the last 100 years or so, the vast majority, certainly of larger scale commercial buildings, have been built using concrete and steel. There are a lot of areas, even in some larger buildings, where timber can also be used. It's another topic I don't have time to discuss today. But just to put it into perspective, the cement that goes into the production of concrete is responsible for about 7 or 8% of total CO2 emissions. 7 or 8%. If it was a country, it would be the third behind the US and China. Just one material, cement that goes into concrete. And you can see the figures for steel. So again, all these materials have their part to play, but particularly with the advent of engineered timber, things like cross-laminated timber, glulam and so on, we can replace a lot of those materials in many areas. And finally, it should be responsibly sourced, by which we basically mean certified. And what that means is that a certified material, it's guaranteed to come from a responsibly managed forest or plantation, and that when a tree is harvested, one or at least one is planted in its place. And certainly the vast majority of timber that's used in the Australian construction sector would be certified by one of the other, or in some cases both of the major worldwide certification bodies. So that's the environmental side of it. But increasingly, to use the word that Tonya just mentioned earlier, there are significant health and well-being benefits that are available. Concept called biophilia, biophilic design. Can I get a show of hands who before today had heard of biophilia? This is entirely consistent. I rarely would ask that question, and I ask it a lot. Would I get more than 15 or 20% of people saying they'd heard it? It's not particularly new. It was first proposed actually in 1964, so 2 years after I was born, by an German-born American psychoanalyst called Erich Fromm. And it was further popularized in 1984 by an American biologist called Edward O. Wilson, who wrote a book called Biophilia. If you're interested in the topic, I commend it to you. So it's not particularly new, but what it basically talks about is the importance of connecting buildings with the natural world. Bio, natural, philia. Philia is opposite to a phobia, so put them together, love or love of natural things. And what the thesis is really quite simple. The more we can use natural materials like timber, indoor plants, natural daylighting and so on, the more we're essentially bringing buildings back to the natural world. And there are proven benefits. I mean, spending time in nature has a restorative quality. Research shows quite conclusively that just 10 minutes a day, ideally in parkland or woodland or just in the outdoors, can be extremely beneficial from a physiological and psychological point of view. It's what we call restorative. And so the whole notion now is to make buildings that are similarly restorative. And the whole notion there, as you can see, and a growing body of research shows quite conclusively that biophilic design buildings have essentially the same properties. They mimic the effect of spending time in nature. So as I say, you can see this biophilia, this love of life, and by extension, biophilic design, bringing these natural material types into the built environment, whether it be our homes, our place of work, hospitals, universities. There are many benefits to be gained by that. And as I mentioned, this whole notion of restoration, so that buildings obviously need to be structurally sound, they need to be safe, but increasingly we need to find ways to make them restorative in the same way that that spending time in nature is restorative. So you can see, you can read for yourself the definition, a process of renewal that replenishes a depleted social, psychological or physical resource. So that's why there's increasing focus on the use of and wood can have a big part to play in this, because we all intrinsically recognize it as being natural. No two pieces of wood are ever the same. The grain patterns and so on, the color, etc. And our resources, particularly if we're in a sort of very austere man-made environment, it may not be quite so prevalent in beautiful areas like this, but certainly in the major cities, research shows quite conclusively that most of us spend at least 90% of our time immersed in man-made environments, whether we're at home or at work or in transit between, and that's leading to what we call a disconnect with nature. So again, the whole idea of this process of biophilic design using natural materials at timber is a way to try and ameliorate some of those effects. The concept called attention restoration theory, particularly in areas where we need to be able to concentrate to do work, obviously offices, universities, schools. Again, the whole notion is that using these natural material types, biophilic design principles, can help provide that additional restorative from an attention point of view. And we're starting to see now schools, as a famous one well-known one in Sydney, Our Lady of the Assumption Catholic Primary School in North Strathfield, which is the first school in Australia built with what's called cross-laminated timber, designed by a German architect, Knut Menden, with whom I've done many, many presentations, and the students absolutely love it. If you get a chance, have a look at it. It really is quite something. And this is a similar school over in WA, using a similar kind of philosophy. This is a little tongue twister. You can't say this after 3 or 4 beers. Psychophysiological stress recovery theory. And that what basically means is that having natural materials, or indeed just simply having a view of nature, can aid recovery from both a physical or a psychological stress. And a good example of that, of course, is recovering from surgery. And again, there's a growing body of research that shows if we can use these types of design principles, and particularly if hospitals can be designed which afford views of nature, post-operative recovery times are reduced. Reliance on drugs can be reduced. So there are significant benefits, and obviously there's an economic benefit that underpins that as well. Another name for you, Stephen R Kellet. He's written a couple of books on the subject. He's an American architect and a doyen of biophilic design, and he proposed a concept, as you can see, essentially marrying the two concepts together, this whole notion of responsible environmental design. So you can read the 3 bullet points for yourself, but again, yes, we need to make sure that we're minimizing adverse impacts from a climate change perspective. Wood can play a big part in that, but also making sure that we understand the value, the importance of restoration and designing buildings accordingly. Because what the research shows that if we do this successfully, it produces a reduced stress response, measured conclusions showing reduced blood pressure and heart rate. And particularly in things like schools, for some school children at least, school time can be one of the most stressful times of their life. So using these types of design principle can have a very significant and long-lasting beneficial effect. Research shows again an improved emotional state. A couple of studies, one in New Zealand and one in Japan actually, looked at the behaviour of residents of aged care facilities. One where they're surrounded by man-made materials compared to that where they're surrounded predominantly by natural materials, including wood. And in the latter, they found that they were much more expressive, much more friendly, much more likely to come out and spend time with their cohort and so on. And in Australia, dementia costs of the order of about $5 billion per annum. So again, if we can use these design techniques successfully, there is a very significant economic benefit that can be gained. Wood, as I suspect most of you would know, is what we call hygroscopic. And what that means is it'll either absorb or emit moisture depending on the prevailing relative humidity. So if we're in a very dry, air-conditioned office, wood will help to normalize that by releasing some moisture into the atmosphere. or if we're in a very moist environment, North Queensland in the middle of summer, again, the wood will help to normalise that by absorbing some of that excess moisture. And what we know again from research is that if people, particularly in an office, are dissatisfied with the indoor air quality, their productivity could be adversely impacted by up to about 12%. So there's a significant corporate benefit in incorporating these types of design principles and materials. As our friends from FWPA would well know, 2 years ago, an organisation called Pollinate produced in fact, the first study of its type in the world, where they talked to well over 1,000 respondents across Australia, and they measured a very clear link between the increased use of wood in an office and people's creativity, productivity, satisfaction, and interestingly, reduced absenteeism. So it's not just a whim. There is research that underpins this quite clearly. And all credit to Pollinate for that. As I say, that was a world-leading, world-first research that you can find both on the Wood Solutions website and on the Make It Wood website if you're interested in that type of information. So I guess what I'm trying to say is that all of this is underpinned by academic research. And this is the last one. This is, again, there's another quote from Alex Derike that I mentioned just a moment ago. This is a cancer care facility in Oldham, which is on the west part of Manchester, not far from where I'm from. And I think it really sums up all that I love about timber. And it's, I think, worth articulating Alex's quote. The use of wood at Maggie's Oldham is part of a bigger design intention to reverse the norms of hospital architecture. In wood, there is hope, humanity, scale, and warmth. And for me, that said it all. Thank you very much.